At first glance, we might think that magic has nothing to do with the history of science whatsoever, but appearances can be very deceptive. Many Renaissance thinkers thought that magic was central to the promotion of natural philosophy and technology. One of them, by the name of Giambattista della Porta, wrote in the 16th century that the works of magic are nothing else than the works of nature. And magic is the practical part of natural philosophy. Now, if this seems odd or quaint to us, we have to pause to examine two things. First, what did the Renaissance thinkers like Della Porta think magic actually was? And then second, how is it really related to natural philosophy? How can it be the practical part of natural philosophy? Once we've done that, we're going to spend the rest of the lecture visiting three very curious characters who exemplify different aspects of the natural magic tradition of the Renaissance. So now let's start with what Renaissance natural magic actually is. Natural magic is based on two fundamental principles. One, it's based on a worldview that there exist connections or correspondences between different natural objects, objects that we wouldn't necessarily think were related. Nonetheless, the natural magic tradition says that God has implanted certain correspondences, certain connections between these groups of objects. The second part, which is equally important, is that the person who knows magic, that is, a magus is the name that's given to him, could make use of these connections for practical purposes. So, connections between different objects and the use of those connections to some practical end. In fact, the close relationship to practicality is pointed out by none other than Francis Bacon, Lord Chancellor of England, one of the key figures in developing new methodologies for the study of scientific topics. He writes, a little bit after 1600, he says that magic proposes to recall natural philosophy from a miscellany of speculations to a magnitude of works. So again, this idea that it's practical. Well, what do we mean by these correspondences? What are they? Well, let's take one as an example. Let's take the common sunflower. If you sit in your garden where you might have sunflowers growing, you'll notice that as the day progresses, the sunflower turns from east to west and follows the sun. In the morning, it's back at the east and follows the sun again. Doesn't that imply that there's some connection between the flower and the planet, the sun? They even, in fact, look something alike. The sunflower with its radiant yellow petals, the sun with its bright yellow rays. Is that the only kind of connection that can exist? Well, no, let's extend it. Let's try and be a magus for a moment and make some of the other connections. We've got sunflower to sun. What else might the sun be connected to? Well, let's go from the vegetable world to the mineral world. We've said already that alchemically the sun is connected with gold. So now we have sunflower, gold, sun. How about the animal world? Well, let's use human beings. There are a number of organs inside the human body. The sun is the regent, so to speak, of the cosmos. It's the source of life and warmth. What part of the body would correspond to that? Well, the heart. So sun, sunflower, heart, gold. Now, how might we make use of these? Well, if someone had a heart ailment, we might try making a medicine from the sunflower, because there's a sympathy, as it's called, between the sunflower and the heart, because they belong to the same group. We might instead make a medicine alchemically out of gold. This is, in fact, where the word cordial comes from. It's from the Latin cor, for heart, and a cordial is a heart medicine originally. These were often based in gold in the Renaissance. Or we could hang an amulet of gold metal over the heart, again, bringing the two things in close to one another to affect a relationship between them. These relationships are all sympathetic. There's a positive interaction, just like there's a positive interaction between the moon and anything that's wet, like the seas. As the moon rises overhead, the sea rises and the tide comes in. We know that that's a sympathetic attraction too, but there can also be antipathic interactions. We know, for example, that if we make lute strings out of gut, and we take the gut of a sheep to make one string and the gut of a wolf to make another, and put it on the same lute, you'll never be able to tune the lute because the two can never be tuned to the same note because there's a natural antipathy between the sheep and the wolf, which carries out in the gut that makes the strings. Now, these correspondences mean that one member of the group affects another, influences another, and by the action of analogy, if you learn about one member of the group, you learn something about all the other members of the group. Now, the point of importance for us, answering the question of how is this related to science, to natural philosophy, is that the Magus has to discover these correspondences. In other words, he has to figure out what the groupings actually are. Where does antipathy and sympathy lie? Now, this could be done in several ways. It could be done from textual sources, so look at learned authorities. It could be done by observation of the natural world or by experimentation with the natural objects themselves. One way that the natural philosopher, the Magus, can approach this problem is to use what's called the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures says that God gives us a helping hand. In other words, he leaves these markers, these signatures of how things are related. So the Magus has to observe these. Well, let me give you one example. What if we take a walnut? We open the shell very carefully. Do you notice what the walnut nestled in its shell looks like? It looks like a brain, doesn't it? Therefore, the walnut has this shape because God is telling us something. He's telling us so that there's a connection between walnuts and the brain. Therefore, with a brain ailment, one might suggest eating walnuts. Now, in a sense, natural magic drew upon and exploited natural laws in the same way as more familiar forms of technology. We use technology to gain power over our natural environment, to extend the power of man. Natural magic is actually, odd as it sounds, a form of technology. It's a way of producing effects, of extending human power over the world. Now, let's look at some of the sources that the Renaissance drew on, and then we'll look at some people that exemplify it. The Renaissance had many sources for the natural magic tradition. There were some classical authors, first of all. The Neoplatonic author Proclus, whose dates from the 5th century A.D., wrote several works which deal with the correspondences between things and how they can be used for natural effects. The Bible also gives us a background. Remember that in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh's priests are able to turn their staffs into serpents. Certainly a magical act of some sort, not miraculous because God was not on the side of Pharaoh and his priests, clearly in that case. So the priests of Egypt must have had some deep knowledge of magic in order to carry this out. I should mention, having said that we need to think of magic always as something natural and not as something miraculous. We're making use of correspondences that God put in the world in order for man to use them. It's not supernatural, it's not demonic, it's entirely a natural thing. There's also the ancient doctrine of the macrocosm-microcosm that tells us that the heavens above have a natural connection to the earth below. This is the basis of astrology, for example. Well, just as there are relationships between the planets and the way things happen on Earth, or the tendencies of things on Earth, you'll remember that Ptolemy says that the planets extend their natural qualities, like Mars is hot and dry. It increases hotness and dryness on the Earth when it's in particular signs. In the same way, this interaction, whatever it is, it's a non-material interaction between members of linked groups. It's the same way that astrology works, perhaps, the same way the moon evokes the tides. In the previous lecture, I mentioned the Corpus Hermeticum, this ancient body of texts that was thought to have been written by someone contemporary with Moses. There are magical ideas there which are used very frequently. And the translator, Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine, who publishes and translates the Corpus Hermeticum, often invokes magic as an important part of knowledge. There's one other source that's important, and that's the notion of what are called occult qualities. Now, this is something scholastic. And when I use the word occult here, I don't mean it in the 19th century sense of the word, that it's black magic or something. Occult, just from the Latin word occultus, which means hidden or covered up. An occult quality is to be distinguished from a manifest quality. What are the manifest qualities of a thing? Well, hotness, coldness, wetness, dryness, the Aristotelian qualities. And this is a way that we know that things can affect one another. A fire warms in a natural way because it's hot and dry, so it extends its manifest quality of hotness to the object that we put into it. That's easy to explain. But there's a whole slew of qualities that are occult. We cannot explain the effect of certain bodies based on manifest qualities. What's an example? Well, how about the magnet? How about the magnet? Can think of all the manifest qualities of a magnet, but none of them will explain to you how it does this remarkable feat of attracting iron through space and holding it fixed against itself. You can't explain that. That's an occult quality. You also can't explain how it is that opium causes a person to fall asleep. Well, opium has certain tastes. It has certain qualities that Galenic physicians would apply to it, of hot, cold, wet, and dry. But none of those seem to be able to explain how it is that it has this soporific effect on people once it's once it's ingested. That, too, is an occult quality. Well, there's also a link to humanism. Humanism, remember, put a high value on ancient texts, and it sought for new sources of knowledge outside the traditional canons of the university and scholastic literature, scholastic commentary. Magic is about the same thing, in a sense, seeking for alternative sources of knowledge. And as we look through our three characters that we're going to talk about, think about how they're employing new sources of knowledge. Remember through all of this that the goal of the magician is to control and utilize the hidden links and powers found in nature. These could be turned towards medical purposes, gaining knowledge, controlling or redirecting natural events, like a technology. Right, well now let's go on and look at our three characters. The first one I want to talk about is Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. He was born in 1486 and he lives until 1535. He wrote a very important work called Three Books of Occult Philosophy, published 1531 to 1533. It's a veritable compendium of magical knowledge. For Agrippa, magic is the highest form of natural knowledge. The three books comprehensively describe the idea of the doctrine of signatures, the relationships that exist between different groups of objects, how to produce amulets, and various other kinds of occult magical practices. One thing that's very clear about Agrippa is that he is most definitely a humanist. The use of classical sources and allusions is very, very thick. In fact, you'll notice his name, Cornelius Agrippa, is in fact a Roman name, even though he's a German himself. The other thing that's important for Agrippa, interestingly enough, is mathematics. And this is something that we see again and again, that mathematics, besides being an particular interest of the humanists, mathematics is again and again related to magic. Listen to what Agrippa says. He writes, "Mathematics is so necessary to magic and has such an affinity with it that those who profess magic without mathematics are far mistaken. They labor in vain and shall never attain their desired effects." So don't think of magic as some sort of mumbo-jumbo, right? The way we think of magic. It's not pulling rabbits out of hats. It's not that sort of a thing. It's something that's related to humanist interests. It's related to mathematics and natural powers. Agrippa felt that his goal was to restore what he believed to be a holy, ancient magic, to purify it of accreted superstitions that had come upon it in later ages. Again, this is a very humanist type sentiment. Now, the correspondences, as I've said, can only be learned by long experience in the natural world. Well, maybe not. For Agrippa, it's very clear that his experience is not in the natural world. His experience is in classical texts. He's constantly referring to texts from the classical period. He's really a humanist. He's a textual scholar. And that's one way that a magus could deal with magic, through text. So that's Agrippa's story. If we turn to a contemporary of Agrippa, we find a very different position. To the wonderfully named Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus from Hohenheim, otherwise known as Paracelsus. He was born in 1493, about that year, so around the time of the discovery of America, lived until 1541. He is miles away from Agrippa in many, many, many ways. The learned Agrippa, on the one hand, admired the classical tradition. He was a humanist. Paracelsus despised it. The central feature of Paracelsus and Paracelsianism is generally iconoclasm. You can think of Paracelsus as a rebel with a cause. His iconoclasm reaches to everything that's traditional and that is an ordinary, usual source of authority. The other feature of Paracelsus is chemical medicine. Chemistry for him and medicine are the metaphors, are the ways to look at the world. Everything becomes chemical or medical. Well, let's see some of the things he has to say. First, he violently assails medical authorities, both classical and contemporary. It's said that he opened a lecture at the University of Basel by taking the canon of Avicenna and putting it in a pan and setting it alight to show his contempt for traditional medical learning. He also often rejected what he considered to be foreign medicaments, institutions, and ideals in favor of native Germanic ones. Now, he was Swiss. He was born in Einsiedeln, which is now in Switzerland. But one of the things that runs throughout Paracelsus's writings is a kind of German nationalism. He really despised the Italians. Remember that Italy at this time is the center of medical knowledge. All the good medical schools are in Italy. But he rejects Italians, modern Italians. He rejects Romans and Greeks and Arabs as being foreign. He says that Germany has its own people and its own herbs and its own minerals and its own diseases, so we have to look for the cures for German ailments, for German people in German sources, in German materials. He rejects scholastic argument. He rejects university learning. He rejects the university methods. He was a man of tremendous ill temper, violent outbursts. He was hounded from almost every place he set up camp because he invariably got on everybody's bad side within a few minutes. Unlike Agrippa, Paracelsus did not believe that texts were a satisfactory source of knowledge. Where did you get knowledge from? From experience in the world and practice in a chemical furnace, in the fire. Knowledge from experiments in the fire. Well, Paracelsus's worldview, as I've said, is chemically based. He proposed what has been called a chemical worldview, that instead of seeing things in an Aristotelian or a Ptolemaic sense, a classical sense, he saw the human body, for example, as a chemical distillation, as a chemical process, as filled with chemical processes. The earth itself, with the seas evaporating and the rain falling back down, is like a great distilling flask. The cosmos, the whole cosmos, works on chemical-type principles. And God himself is not the geometer of the Platonists. Instead, he's a cosmic chemist who creates the world by chemical processes and embodies chemical processes into it. For Paracelsus as well, spiritual powers are the cause of change in the world, not the material interactions of qualities that the scholastics talk about. Paracelsus provides a whole system of natural philosophy and of medicine that's contrary to Aristotle and Galen. So here again we have now an alternative worldview. Paracelsus also added to chemistry itself. We'll talk about this more later, but he adopted the old Islamic dyad of mercury and sulfur, the two things that come together to form the metals, and added a third principle, salt. So now there's a material trinity that mirrors the divine trinity. He also extended mercury, sulfur, and salt to all substances rather than just metals. That's what everything is made out of. The utility for chemistry for Paracelsus comes from the process he calls Scheidung, or division, separation. By dividing out the principles, we can produce good medicines, get rid of toxins, produce things that are useful for life. Now, I can't hide from the fact, nor would I want to, that many Paracelsian notions can be called bizarre. They're difficult to comprehend. Indeed, sometimes they're often obscurantist, meaning that they're intended to be obscure. It was said by one of Paracelsus's companions that all of his works were dictated while he was drunk. And if you read enough Paracelsus, you may come to believe this. Now, even though Paracelsus's writings and ideas are very poorly organized, they were rationalized by his followers because it was a new kind of system. It was something iconoclastic against general university learning, against the classical tradition. Paracelsianism, despite the problems of Paracelsus himself, gained an enormously wide following for over a century. Paracelsianism becomes a very important part of natural philosophy and of medicine as well. Now, it is true that a lot of people took it up probably partly on account of its iconoclastic nature. In modern terms, it's in a sense what we might call outsider science. That is to say that it was popular among people who were not university trained, particularly medical practitioners who were not university trained, and you can see why it would be appealing. You don't have a university degree, you have sort of a folk knowledge of medicine. Well, here's someone who's sort of on your side in a sense. He doesn't require you to go get a degree from a university because he thinks that's useless. Just burn your books, sell them off, get a walking stick and walk around the world, visit mines and look at plants and animals, and you'll learn how to be a physician. It was also popular among Protestants and Germans. Again, there's an iconoclasm there. The tension between the German world, which is considered barbaric in the classical tradition, and the classical Mediterranean world. There's also the Protestant Catholic divide, and all sorts of others outside the traditional university structure found Paracelsianism to be very interesting and very powerful to them. We'll talk a little bit more about Paracelsus later as well. But notice the difference between this iconoclastic Paracelsus and the humanist Agrippa, opposite ends of the spectrum. The third magus I want to talk about is John Dee. Now, John Dee is a little later than the other two. He's born in 1527. He lives to 1608. He's an Englishman. He's an Elizabethan mathematician and natural philosopher. He lives at the same time. The end of his life corresponds with that of Shakespeare, overlaps with Shakespeare. And in fact, it has been suggested that the figure of Prospero in The Tempest, the wizard Prospero, is actually modeled by Shakespeare on John Dee. Now, John Dee illustrates some of the realms that are within natural philosophy, but also some of the realms that are beyond natural philosophy, and the potentially close connection that there can be between magic and scientific mathematical knowledge. Let me say a little bit more about Dee first. He was recognized as a mathematician, as a polymath, as a writer. He had the largest private library in England. He was involved in the production of the first English translation of Euclid from the Greek in 1570. He wrote the preface to it, which is very interesting, talking about the importance of mathematics. Dee's mathematical interests were far-ranging, and he was well recognized for this. But he had other interests. Certainly, the relationship between mathematics and astronomy, astrology is very close indeed. Dee was asked to choose a date for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I based upon astrological considerations, and the day of her coronation was one that was supposed to be astrologically propitious. He also encouraged the Queen to explore and exploit the New World. In fact, he's often credited with being the first person to use the term the British Empire. There is also, on the other side, a popular rumor that he was a sorcerer. And this seems to have come about because, according to the story, whether it's true or not, we don't actually know, when he was a student at Cambridge, he constructed a mechanical flying beetle that was used in a performance of a play by Aristophanes. Now, since no one could figure out how the beetle actually flew across the stage, it was considered to be a product of the black arts. Well, there's always a close relationship between technology and magic. I want to reiterate that once again. As for the connection between dark magic and white magic, or natural magic and demonic magic, well, in this time period, usually the good magic is whatever I'm doing, and the dark magic, the demonic magic, is whatever someone else is doing that doesn't agree with me. Nonetheless, there is this relationship as well between technology and magic. Unlike some of his contemporaries, some of his humanist contemporaries, Dee used the medieval sources much more. His library was full of medieval texts. Certainly, Roger Bacon was extremely important to him. Remember Roger Bacon, the medieval Franciscan friar of the 13th century, at Oxford of the 13th century, who had this idea of the multiplication of species, that qualities could be propagated across a distance. That is, fire warms something at a distance because it projects the quality of heat at a distance. Dee used this idea of the multiplication of qualities, the multiplication of species, to account for astrological effects and for the action of the correspondences between things in the natural world upon which natural magic is based. But Dee also did something that's very curious that we have yet to have a good explanation of. For more than 20 years, he carried out conversations with angels. At least that's what he says he did. He used a holy table, as he called it, carved with certain sigils and patterns, and gazing stones. For example, a polished mirror of obsidian. This polished obsidian gazing stone is actually still in the British Library. It's preserved there. You can see it. And he used scryers, one most important by the name of Edward Kelly, who would look into this gazing stone and describe what he saw to Dee, who then took down what was seen. The idea was that Kelly and other scryers, because he used 3 different ones, were able to see spiritual entities and various scenes within the stone. What was really going on in these sessions remains a bit of a mystery, but there are literally dozens of volumes of notebooks of the conversations that were carried out. What is clear, regardless of what was actually going on, whether it was Edward Kelly having a joke on Dee, then you'd have to explain the other 2 scryers doing the same thing, or what was going on, we don't know. But what is clear is that Dee thought he could learn the secrets of the universe by having God's own angels, who were after all present at the creation of the world, tell them to him. Talk about going to find an alternate source of knowledge. That's about as far away from the scholastic method as you can get. Many of Dee's surviving notes are full of an angelic language, which, being the language by which God created the universe, would naturally have great power. So Dee endeavored to learn this language in order to manipulate creation. Again, this utility part of magic, usefulness, use the angelic language, the divine language, to find out about the world and to do stuff with it. Well, the impact of Renaissance natural magic on the development of modern science has been hotly debated for a long time. And let's keep an eye on it in the next few lectures. It's going to recur. Let me just mention quickly 4 ways in which it's important. First, its finding of alternative sources of knowledge and methods of learning. Second, its emphasis on action. This, in fact, is similar to the humanists' interest in an active civic life. So this action is important. The emphasis on observing things that are hidden in the world. So you have to go out and find things. You have to increase your observations of the natural world. Clearly, that's closely linked to the natural sciences. And fourth, it emphasizes human power over the world. In part, this is adopted from earlier Neoplatonic ideals. Roger Bacon, Hugh of St. Victor said the same sort of things. But it's a notable counterpoint to the contemplative style of scholastic notions. And it is a feature that's familiar to all of us in modern science and technology. Well, in the next lecture, we're going to switch from magic to astronomy. We're going to examine the work of Nicholas Copernicus, who is famed for his crazy idea that the Earth is actually in motion and the sun stands still after all.